The playground at Lincoln Elementary School in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, sat empty that afternoon in late October 1977, the swings moving gently in the autumn wind, their chains creaking in rhythm with the falling leaves. But one child who should have been there, who always stopped at that playground on the walk home, never arrived. 7-year-old Jennifer Marie Caldwell vanished on October 28, 1977, disappearing in the 14-minute window between leaving her classroom at 3:15 and the moment her mother expected her home at 3:30. For 47 years, the swing where Jennifer loved to play hung still, waiting. The question that haunted Harrisburg for nearly half a century was simple, terrible, and seemingly unanswerable. Where did Jennifer go? Harrisburg in 1977 was a city caught between its industrial past and an uncertain future. The steel mills along the Susquehanna River were beginning to close, leaving neighborhoods like Cameron Heights in a kind of suspended animation. The houses were modest, well-kept ranches and Cape Cods built in the post-war boom, their small yards bordered by chain-link fences. Neighbors knew each other. Children played outside until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and kids walked to school alone. The Caldwell family lived at 847 Maple Grove Avenue, a cream-colored ranch with brown shutters, and a carefully tended garden where Margaret Caldwell grew tomatoes and marigolds. Margaret worked mornings as a receptionist at Dr. Henderson's dental office on Market Street. Her husband, Robert Caldwell, was a supervisor at the Bethlehem steel plant, working the day shift from 7 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon. They had 2 children. Jennifer was 7, a second grader with brown hair she wore in 2 braids, secured with the rubber bands her mother bought in packs of 10 from the Woolworths downtown. Her older brother, Timothy, was 12, a 6th grader who walked a different route home because his school let out earlier. Jennifer's routine was unchanging. Every school day, she left Lincoln Elementary at 3:15 when the bell rang. The walk home took exactly 14 minutes if she walked directly, but Jennifer always took 16 or 17 minutes because she stopped at the playground. She would pump her legs on the swing exactly 10 times, counting out loud, then continue home. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down, could set her kitchen timer by Jennifer's arrival. 3:30 every day the screen door would bang shut and Jennifer would call out, "Mom, I'm home." Clear's throat. October 28, 1977 was a Friday. The weather that day was recorded as partly cloudy, temperature 54 degrees, wind from the northwest at 8 miles per hour. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would make a mother worry. Margaret Caldwell had the day off from Dr. Henderson's office. She spent the morning cleaning the house, doing laundry, preparing dinner. Robert was at work. Timothy was at a friend's house after school. At 3:25, Margaret started watching for Jennifer through the kitchen window while she peeled potatoes for dinner. 3:30 came and went. 3:35. Margaret walked to the front porch, looked down Maple Grove Avenue toward the school. Empty sidewalk, fallen leaves scattered across the concrete. 3:40. She walked to the corner. 3:45. She walked to the school. The playground was empty. The swings moved in the wind, that distinctive creaking sound of metal on metal. Jennifer's teacher, Mrs. Morrison, was locking up her classroom. Yes, she confirmed, Jennifer had left with the other children at 3:15. She'd been wearing her blue jacket with the white stripes on the sleeves, carrying her Snoopy lunchbox. Mrs. Morrison had watched the children leave as she always did, making sure they all went in the right direction. Jennifer had turned left, toward home like always. Margaret ran home to call Robert at work. He left the steel plant immediately, arriving home at 4:10. By 4:30, they'd driven the route between school and home 3 times. They'd knocked on every door. No one had seen Jennifer, At 4:45, Robert called the Harrisburg Police Department. Officer David Klein arrived at 5:15. He was a patrol officer, young, only 2 years on the force, and he took down the information methodically. Female child, age 7, brown hair, brown eyes, 4 feet 2 inches tall, approximately 60 pounds. Last seen wearing blue jacket, red corduroy pants, white sneakers. Carrying Snoopy lunchbox and small pink backpack, missing approximately 2 hours. The search began immediately. By 6 o'clock, as darkness fell, 23 officers were walking grid patterns through Cameron Heights. Neighbors emerged from their homes with flashlights. Someone brought a German Shepherd that wasn't trained for search work but might help anyway. They called Jennifer's name into the October darkness. The beam of flashlights swept across yards, under porches, into garden sheds. Nothing. By midnight, the search had expanded to a 2-mile radius. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the woods behind the school. Officers checked every unlocked car, every garage, every possible place a child might hide or be hidden. The Susquehanna River was only 8 blocks away. Officers walked its banks with searchlights. At 2 in the morning, the temperature dropped to 41 degrees. Margaret Caldwell sat at her kitchen table, Jennifer's lunch box in front of her, still unopened. Robert stood on the front porch, as if his daughter might somehow appear if he just kept watching. Saturday morning brought daylight and expanded search efforts. Detective Lawrence Brennan from the Criminal Investigation Division took over the case. He was 42 years old, a 20-year veteran who'd worked exactly 3 missing child cases in his career. 2 had been runaways who came home within 48 hours. 1 had been a custody dispute where the father had taken the child to Ohio. None had been like this. The search now involved 80 volunteers, the state police, and officers from 3 neighboring jurisdictions. They walked through the woods systematically, marking off sections with orange tape. Divers prepared to search the river. Television crews from Harrisburg and Philadelphia arrived. Margaret Caldwell's face appeared on the evening news, pleading for information. The image of Jennifer from her 2nd grade school picture was printed on flyers. 5,000 copies were distributed by Sunday afternoon. Those who knew the Caldwells said they were a normal family, quiet, kept to themselves somewhat but were always friendly. Robert was described as a hard worker, dedicated father, maybe a bit stern but not unusual for that time. Margaret was soft-spoken, devoted to her children. Timothy, the 12-year-old son, helped with the search, walking through the neighborhood in a kind of daze, calling his sister's name. Clear's throat, but there were small things. Details that didn't quite fit together properly. Robert Caldwell had said he left work immediately when Margaret called, arriving home at 4:10. But the timekeeper at Bethlehem Steel recorded him clocking out at 3:35. The drive from the plant to Maple Grove Avenue took exactly 18 minutes in normal traffic. Officer Klein noted this in his report but didn't question it initially. Men often rounded times, especially when upset. On Saturday morning, when Detective Brennan interviewed Robert Caldwell in detail, Robert mentioned he'd driven around the neighborhood looking for Jennifer before Margaret called him at work. But Margaret said she'd called him immediately after walking to the school and finding it empty, which would have been approximately 3:40. Brennan made a note, timeline inconsistency. Robert's car, a 1974 Ford Granada, was parked in the driveway. A neighbor mentioned seeing it there around 3 o'clock that Friday afternoon, which seemed odd since Robert worked until 3:30. The neighbor, Mrs. Dolores Humphrey, who lived directly across the street, told deputies she'd been watching her afternoon stories and had looked out the window during a commercial break. She was fairly certain it was around 3, maybe a few minutes after. She remembered because she'd thought it unusual that Robert was home early. When Detective Brennan asked Robert about this, Robert said Mrs. Humphrey must have been mistaken. He'd been at work. He had been at work all day. There was some tension in his voice, Brennan noted, but that was understandable. The man's daughter was missing. The odometer on Robert's Granada showed 47,382 miles on Saturday morning. Brennan made a note of it, though he wasn't sure why at the time. Just something to record. Distance from the Caldwell home to Bethlehem Steel, 8.7 miles each way. By Monday, the search had found nothing. No trace of Jennifer. No witnesses who'd seen anything suspicious. No evidence of foul play, but equally, no evidence of where she might have gone. The woods had been searched. The river had been searched. Every abandoned building within a 5-mile radius had been checked. It was as if Jennifer had simply vanished between the school and her home, in broad daylight, on a normal October afternoon. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the father. There was something about his demeanor. He was too calm, perhaps, too controlled. He answered questions precisely, almost rehearsed. But grief affected people differently, and there was no evidence, nothing concrete. The investigation began to slow. Leads that seemed promising led nowhere. A reported sighting in Philadelphia turned out to be a different child. An anonymous tip about a suspicious van in the neighborhood the previous week couldn't be substantiated. By December, the case was still open but no longer active. The family waited. The community remembered. The swing at Lincoln Elementary playground hung still. Part 2. The investigation. The weeks following Jennifer's disappearance saw an investigation that grew increasingly desperate and increasingly focused. Detective Brennan assembled a timeline minute by minute of October 28, 1977. 3:15, Jennifer left school with approximately 40 other children. Mrs. Morrison, her teacher, watched from the classroom window. Jennifer turned left on Harrison Street, her normal route home. 3:17, Mrs. Alice Chen, who lived on Harrison Street, saw Jennifer walking past her house. She remembered because she was getting her mail and Jennifer waved to her, as she often did. 3:19 to 3:30, no confirmed sightings. 3:30, Margaret Caldwell expected Jennifer home. She wasn't there. 3:35, Robert Caldwell clocked out at Bethlehem Steel. 3:40, Margaret walked to the school. 4:10, Robert arrived home. The gap between 3:17 and 3:30 was only 13 minutes. In those 13 minutes, Jennifer disappeared. The community response was overwhelming. Volunteers organized into shifts. Someone created a command center in the basement of St. Mary's Catholic Church. Maps were marked with search grids. Coffee was brewed around the clock. Women from the neighborhood brought food for the search teams. Men took vacation days from work to help look. For 2 weeks, Cameron Heights was filled with strangers walking slowly, looking carefully at everything. The media coverage intensified. Jennifer's picture appeared on the front page of the Harrisburg Patriot News for 8 consecutive days. Television stations ran her story every evening. The mayor made a statement. The police department held daily press conferences. Margaret Caldwell appeared on camera multiple times, her face growing thinner, her eyes more hollow. Robert stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, saying little. Clear's throat, but the inconsistencies continued to accumulate. On November 3rd, Detective Brennan interviewed the timekeeper at Bethlehem Steel again, requesting specific records for October 28th. The records were clear. Robert Caldwell had clocked in at 7:02 in the morning. He'd taken his lunch break from 12:15 to 12:45. He'd clocked out at 3:35 in the afternoon. The timekeeper, Harold Simmons, remembered it specifically because Robert had seemed rushed, almost frantic when he left. Brennan drove from Bethlehem Steel to Maple Grove Avenue 6 times over the course of a week, at different times of day, measuring the drive. Fastest time, 16 minutes. Average time, 18 minutes. If Robert left at 3:35 and drove straight home, he should have arrived between 3:51 and 3:53. He said he'd arrived at 4:10, but he also said he'd driven around looking first. Brennan checked the odometer on the Granada again on November 5th, 47,401 miles, 19 miles driven in 1 week. Robert said he'd been too upset to go to work, had barely left the house. Where had those 19 miles taken him? On November 8th, Brennan interviewed Mrs. Dolores Humphrey again, the neighbor who'd said she saw Robert's car in the driveway around 3 o'clock on October 28th. She remained certain. She'd been watching The Doctors, which aired from 2 to 3. During the final commercial break, maybe 2:58 or 2:59, she'd looked out her front window and seen the Granada in the Caldwell driveway. She was sure because she'd thought, Robert must be sick today, home from work. When confronted with this, Robert's explanation changed slightly. He said he'd forgotten. He'd actually left work at lunch, feeling unwell, then gone back. He'd been home briefly around 3. But the time card showed no clock out at lunch beyond the normal break, and his supervisor, when contacted, said Robert had been at his station all afternoon. The physical evidence was frustratingly minimal. Jennifer's lunchbox was never found. Her backpack was never found. No one reported seeing her after 3:17. No one saw a struggle. No one heard a scream. In a neighborhood where people knew each other, where children played outside and mothers watched from windows, a 7-year-old girl had vanished without a trace. Brennan returned to the Caldwell house repeatedly. He walked the route from school to home 20 times. He interviewed every person who'd been on those streets that afternoon. A postal carrier, a delivery driver, a woman walking her dog. All remembered it being an ordinary day. None saw Jennifer after 3:17. On November 15th, Brennan spoke with Timothy, the 12-year-old brother, for the 3rd time. Timothy was quiet, withdrawn. He said he'd been at his friend David's house that afternoon. They'd been building a model airplane in David's basement. He hadn't known anything was wrong until his father called David's house around 4:30, asking if Timothy had seen Jennifer. Something in the way Timothy answered questions bothered Brennan, though he couldn't articulate what. The boy seemed frightened, but that was natural. His sister was missing. Yet there was something else, something in how he wouldn't quite meet Brennan's eyes when talking about his father. Those who knew him said Timothy had always been close to his mother, more distant with Robert. Nothing unusual in that. Plenty of boys were mama's boys. But since Jennifer's disappearance, Timothy barely spoke to his father. He ate dinner in silence. He stayed in his room. When Robert spoke to him, Timothy answered in monosyllables. By December, the investigation had effectively stalled. Brennan had theories but no evidence. He had inconsistencies but no proof. He had suspicions but no probable cause for arrest. The state police had been consulted. They'd found nothing Brennan hadn't found. The FBI had been notified but declined to take over the case, as there was no evidence of crossing state lines. Deputies whispered more openly now. Robert Caldwell's behavior was odd. He'd shown little emotion. He'd been cooperative but in a strange, mechanical way. He'd answered every question but often with slightly different details each time. His timeline didn't match the evidence. His car had been seen at home when it shouldn't have been. The odometer showed miles that couldn't be explained, but suspicion wasn't evidence. Inconsistencies weren't proof. In the American justice system, you needed more than whispers and wrong details. You needed evidence of a crime. The case went cold, not officially closed but inactive. Jennifer Caldwell was entered into the National Database of Missing Children. Her file sat in Detective Brennan's office, growing thicker with reports that led nowhere. The search teams disbanded. The command center at St. Mary's closed. The television crews moved on to other stories. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though nothing was truly normal anymore. The swing at Lincoln Elementary playground remained empty. Other children played there, but people still thought of it as Jennifer's swing, the one she'd pumped exactly 10 times every day on her way home. Part 3. The silence. In March of 1978, 5 months after Jennifer's disappearance, the Caldwell family moved. Not far, just to the other side of Harrisburg, but far enough that the neighbors no longer watched them. Far enough that Margaret didn't have to walk past the playground every time she went to the grocery store. The new house was smaller, a rental on Dairy Street in a neighborhood that didn't know their story. Margaret had stopped working. She spent her days cleaning the house, cooking meals that often went uneaten, staring at Jennifer's school picture that she'd hung in the living room. Robert continued working at Bethlehem Steel, though he'd been moved to a different shift, different duties. The supervisors thought it might help. Timothy started at a new school in January, finishing 6th grade among strangers. He spoke to no one about his sister. When asked by other students why he'd transferred mid-year, he said his family had moved. Nothing more. He came home immediately after school, went to his room, closed the door. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt suspicion growing like a cold spot in your chest, you might understand what the following months were like in the Caldwell household. Margaret said nothing directly, but she began to notice things. The way Robert couldn't look at Jennifer's picture. The way he left rooms when the subject of her disappearance came up. The way he developed a slight tremor in his right hand, barely noticeable, but there. She noticed how Timothy avoided his father, how the boy flinched slightly if Robert raised his voice. How Timothy ate dinner as quickly as possible, then retreated to his room. Mother and son had always been close, but now there was something else, something unspoken that passed between them in looks and silence. In May of 1978, Timothy began having nightmares. Margaret would hear him crying out in his sleep, would go to his room and find him sitting up in bed, shaking. When she asked what he'd dreamed, he said he couldn't remember. But one night he whispered, "It was the car, Mom. I keep dreaming about the car." Margaret asked what he meant. Timothy wouldn't elaborate. He was 12 years old, carrying something too heavy for a child to bear alone, but unable or unwilling to speak it. Clear's throat, the marriage deteriorated slowly, like a building settling on a cracked foundation. Robert and Margaret spoke less and less. Entire days would pass with only necessary communication. "Dinner's ready. I'll be working late. Timothy needs new shoes." The spaces between words grew wider and colder. Margaret began to watch Robert in ways she never had before. She noticed he'd burned some papers in the backyard in November, shortly after the investigation had slowed. She'd asked what they were. He'd said old work documents, nothing important. But she remembered the smoke, the careful way he'd stirred the ashes to make sure everything had burned completely. She noticed the odometer now. She'd never paid attention before, but now she marked it mentally. Robert said he drove to work and back, occasionally to the store. The distances never quite added up. In August of 1978, she began writing down the numbers in a small notebook she kept hidden in her dresser drawer. 47,892, 47,911, 48,003. More miles than his daily routine would explain. One Saturday in September, Margaret found Timothy in the garage, sitting in the Granada, not doing anything, just sitting in the passenger seat. When she asked what he was doing, he said, "Trying to remember." "Remember what, honey?" Timothy looked at her with old eyes in a young face and said, "I don't know, something important. Something I should tell you." But he couldn't or wouldn't say more, and Margaret didn't push, though her heart was hammering in her chest. In November of 1978, 1 year after Jennifer's disappearance, Margaret and Robert sat in silence at the kitchen table. The newspaper had run a 1-year anniversary article. The vanishing, 1 year later, no answers in Caldwell case. Jennifer's picture was there again, her school photo with the braids and the slight smile. Robert stood abruptly, left the house, drove somewhere. He returned 3 hours later. Margaret didn't ask where he'd gone. She was afraid of the answer. By January of 1979, Margaret was sleeping in the spare bedroom. By March, she'd contacted a lawyer about separation. She didn't mention her suspicions. She couldn't. They were formless things, built from silences and strange moments, and the way her son flinched, and the miles on the odometer that didn't add up. How do you accuse someone of something you can't name? Timothy turned 13 in April. He'd grown quiet to the point of invisibility, moving through the house like a ghost. His grades were poor. His teachers said he seemed depressed, distracted. Margaret took him to a counselor, but Timothy sat in the office and said nothing for 50 minutes, week after week. On June 12, 1979, Margaret and Timothy moved out. They found an apartment on the east side of Harrisburg, 2 bedrooms, nothing special. Robert helped them move their belongings in his Granada. The 3 of them made the trip in silence, loading boxes, unloading boxes, not speaking. When it was done, Robert stood in the doorway of the empty apartment and said, "Margaret, I never," but he didn't finish. Margaret waited, but he just shook his head and left. Timothy watched his father drive away, then said to his mother, "He knows that I know." Margaret's blood went cold. "Know what, Timothy?" But Timothy just shook his head and went to his room, and the door closed, and the silence that had defined their family since October 28, 1977 continued. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have lived with suspicion poisoning every interaction, you know that silence can be louder than any accusation. You know that sometimes the worst part is not knowing, is living in the space between suspicion and certainty, between fear and proof. The years passed slowly. Jennifer's case remained open but inactive. Detective Brennan retired in 1983, the file still in his office, still unsolved. The new detective assigned to cold cases reviewed it periodically, but had no new leads to pursue. Margaret worked as a bank teller. Timothy finished high school, enlisted in the Army, left Harrisburg and rarely came back. Robert continued working at Bethlehem Steel until the plant closed in 1995, then found work as a maintenance supervisor at a warehouse. The community slowly forgot. New tragedies replaced old ones. The picture of Jennifer Caldwell was filed away in newspaper archives. Her classmates grew up, graduated, married, had children of their own. The swing at Lincoln Elementary was replaced in 1989, part of a playground renovation. No one remembered anymore which one had been Jennifer's, but Timothy remembered. In his quiet way, carrying his burden alone, he remembered everything. Part 4. The revelation on March 14, 2024, 46 years and 4 months after Jennifer Caldwell disappeared, the Harrisburg Police Department received a phone call. The caller was Timothy Caldwell, now 59 years old, living in Arizona, retired from the Army after 25 years of service. He told the detective who answered that he needed to talk about his sister's case. He said he'd been silent long enough. The call was transferred to Detective Sarah Martinez, who'd been assigned to the cold case unit for 3 years. She'd reviewed the Caldwell file multiple times, struck by the inconsistencies, the suspicious circumstances, but without any new evidence to pursue. She listened as Timothy spoke for 47 minutes, his voice steady but strained. He said he'd been at his friend David's house on October 28, 1977, but not all afternoon. He'd come home around 3 o'clock to get his baseball glove, planning to go back to David's. When he'd entered the house through the back door, he'd heard voices in the garage. His father's voice low and urgent, and Jennifer's voice crying. Timothy said he'd frozen in the kitchen. He'd been 12 years old. The garage door was closed, but he could hear them through the wall. His father saying, "You can't tell anyone, you have to promise. This is our secret." Jennifer crying harder. Then a sound Timothy couldn't identify, a thump or impact, and Jennifer went quiet. Timothy said he'd run. He'd left through the back door and run back to David's house, and stayed there until his father called looking for Jennifer hours later. He'd been terrified. He'd been 12 years old and terrified, and when his father picked him up and asked if he'd seen his sister, Timothy said no. Because the look in his father's eyes made him understand that was the only safe answer. He said he'd wanted to tell. For weeks, months, years, he'd wanted to tell. But he'd been a child and Robert was his father and the fear was too great. He said he'd tried to hint to his mother, to Detective Brennan, to anyone, but the words wouldn't come. He said the guilt had eaten at him every day for 46 years. He said he was ready to testify. He knew it might not be enough, might not hold up legally after all this time, but he had to try. He couldn't carry it anymore. Clear's throat, Detective Martinez flew to Arizona the next day. She interviewed Timothy for 6 hours, recording everything. His account was detailed, specific, consistent. He described the layout of the old house on Maple Grove Avenue. He described what his father had been wearing that day. He described the sound of Jennifer's Snoopy lunchbox hitting the garage floor. Martinez returned to Harrisburg and reopened the case officially on March 19, 2024. She brought in the Pennsylvania State Police. They assembled a team of 4 detectives and began working through the old evidence with new eyes and new technology. The original case file was extensive. Detective Brennan had documented everything. The timeline inconsistencies, the odometer readings, Mrs. Humphrey's testimony about seeing the car at 3 o'clock, the supervisor's statement that Robert had seemed frantic when leaving work. All of it was there, waiting. On April 2, 2024, detectives interviewed Mrs. Dolores Humphrey again. She was 91 years old now, living in a nursing home, but her memory of that afternoon was crystal clear. She'd seen Robert Caldwell's Granada in the driveway around 3 o'clock on October 28, 1977. She was certain. She'd thought it was unusual. She'd mentioned it to the police at the time. They interviewed Harold Simmons, the timekeeper from Bethlehem Steel, who was 83 and retired. He remembered Robert clocking out at 3:35, remembered him seeming rushed, almost panicked. The old time cards had been preserved in company archives. They confirmed it. Robert had been at work until 3:35. The new investigation calculated distances with modern tools. Bethlehem Steel to Maple Grove Avenue, 8.7 miles, minimum 16 minutes in 1977 traffic. Robert claimed he'd left work immediately when Margaret called, but she'd called around 3:40. He couldn't have been home at 3 o'clock, unless he'd left work earlier and the time card was wrong, or unless he'd clocked out, driven home, and somehow clocked back in. But there was no record of that, unless Timothy was right, unless Robert had gone home at lunch at 12:45 when his official lunch break ended, unless he'd been there when Jennifer came home from school at her usual time, which wasn't 3:30 but earlier on Fridays. Unless the whole timeline had been a lie. Detectives pulled school records from 1977. Lincoln Elementary had early dismissal on Fridays. Classes ended at 2:45, not 3:15. Mrs. Morrison, Jennifer's teacher, had been confused in her original statement, thinking of the regular schedule. Jennifer had left school at 2:45 on October 28, 1977. 2:45 to 3 o'clock, 15 minutes, exactly the time it took to walk home, stopping at the swing for exactly 10 pumps. Everything clicked into place with terrible clarity. Robert had been home. He'd taken his lunch break from 12:15 to 12:45, but he'd never returned to work. He'd stayed home. When Jennifer arrived at 3 o'clock, he was there. Something happened in that garage. Something that made him return to work at 3:35, frantic, and clock out, establishing an alibi. Something that made him lie about his timeline. Something that explained the odometer, because he'd driven somewhere that afternoon, somewhere he needed to dispose of evidence, of a small body, of a Snoopy lunchbox and a pink backpack. On May 1st, 2024, the Pennsylvania State Police, working with the Dauphin County District Attorney's Office, obtained a warrant for Robert Caldwell's arrest. He was 72 years old, still living in Harrisburg, retired, alone. Detectives arrived at his apartment at 6 in the morning. One of the arresting officers later said that when they told Robert he was being arrested for the disappearance and suspected death of his daughter Jennifer, he seemed almost relieved. He said nothing, didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't protest his innocence. He just nodded slowly and held out his wrists for the handcuffs. The arrest made national news. Pennsylvania cold case solved after 47 years. Father arrested in 1977, disappearance of daughter. The story appeared on every major network. Margaret Caldwell, now 75 years old, gave one statement to the press. "I knew. Part of me always knew. But knowing and proving are different things. I'm grateful to my son for his courage." Timothy Caldwell did not speak to the media. The arraignment took place on May 3, 2024. Robert Caldwell was charged with first-degree murder, and abuse of a corpse. He appeared before Judge Helen Martinez, entered a plea of not guilty, and was held without bail. The preliminary hearing was set for June 15, 2024. Timothy was listed as the primary witness. The district attorney, Michael Reynolds, told reporters that while the case was challenging due to the passage of time and the lack of physical evidence, Timothy's testimony, combined with the documented inconsistencies in Robert's statements, created a strong circumstantial case. On June 10, 2024, 5 days before the preliminary hearing, Robert Caldwell's attorney contacted the district attorney's office. Robert wanted to make a statement. On June 12, 2024, Robert Caldwell confessed. The confession was given in the presence of his attorney, the district attorney, and Detective Martinez. It was recorded and transcribed. 47 years of silence ended in 3 hours of halting, terrible truth. Robert said Jennifer had come home from school that Friday afternoon. He'd been home, supposedly on his lunch break, but he'd called in sick after lunch, said he wasn't coming back that day. He'd been angry about something at work, some argument with his supervisor. He'd been drinking, which he rarely did, but that day he had. Jennifer had come home and found him in the garage, found him with her mother's jewelry box, which he'd broken into looking for something to pawn. He didn't explain why. Money troubles, perhaps. Desperation. Jennifer had been scared, seeing her father like that, angry and drunk at 3 in the afternoon when he should have been at work. She'd said she was going to tell her mother. Robert said he'd grabbed her, trying to quiet her, trying to make her understand she couldn't tell. He'd shaken her. She'd fallen. Her head had struck the concrete floor of the garage. He said he'd panicked. He'd checked for a pulse, found none. He'd put her in the trunk of the Granada. He'd driven to a construction site 20 miles outside Harrisburg, where they were excavating for a new shopping center. He'd buried her there, under what would become the foundation. He'd returned home, disposed of her backpack and lunchbox in a dumpster behind a grocery store. Then he'd driven to work and clocked out at his normal time, creating an alibi. He said he'd lived with it every day. The guilt, the knowledge of what he'd done. He said he'd known Timothy had seen or heard something, had known his son was carrying that weight, but he'd been too coward to confess, too afraid of prison, too ashamed to face the truth. He said he was sorry. He said it wasn't enough. He said nothing would ever be enough. On August 20th, 2024, Robert Caldwell pleaded guilty to degree murder and abuse of a corpse. The first-degree murder charge was dropped as part of the plea agreement. He was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in state prison. At 72 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. On September 3, 2024, excavation began at what was now the Harrisburg Valley Mall parking lot, built in 1978 on the site Robert had described. Forensic anthropologists from the state police worked carefully through layers of concrete and earth. On September 17, 2024, they found remains. Small bones, fragments of blue fabric, a metal zipper from a child's jacket. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. Jennifer Marie Caldwell had been found. The funeral took place on October 28, 2024, exactly 47 years after her disappearance. She was buried at Rolling Green Cemetery beside her grandfather. Margaret was there leaning on Timothy's arm. Former neighbors came. Mrs. Patricia, her second-grade teacher, now 94. Detective Brennan's widow, bringing flowers on behalf of her husband who died still wondering if the case would ever be solved. Those who believed in Robert's innocence, the few who'd maintained he couldn't have done such a thing, were silent now. Those who doubted him, who'd whispered suspicions for decades, took no satisfaction in being right. There was only sadness, profound and complete, for a life that ended at 7 years old, for 47 years of silence, for a family destroyed by secrets and fear. The community gathered once more, as they had in 1977, but this time for closure rather than search. The local news covered the funeral. Jennifer's story was told again, but this time with an ending, terrible and final. Closing the case of Jennifer Marie Caldwell reminds us that justice, even when delayed for nearly half a century, still matters. That truth, even buried under concrete and silence and fear, will eventually surface. That children like Jennifer deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as the people they might have become. A 7-year-old girl who counted her swings, who waved at neighbors, who came home at 3:30 every day until the day she didn't.